Hello. As you can see, I am not Mary Ellen O'Connell. Sorry to disappoint. I'm Peter Campbell, PhD candidate in political science, University of Notre Dame, soon to be of Baylor Political Science. Working on my dissertation is on the origins of military doctrine. So let me just introduce our speakers and we'll get right to it. Randall Dipert is the C.S. Pierce Professor of American Philosophy at the State University of New York at Buffalo, where he teaches courses on the ethics of war and peace and logic. He had a recent piece in the Journal of Military Ethics entitled Other Than Internet Cyber Warfare, Challenges for Ethics, Law, and Policy. His paper today is entitled Distinctive Ethical Issues of Cyber Warfare. The Chinese are mostly innocent. Mostly, only mostly. Scott Shackelford is Assistant Professor of Business Law and Ethics at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. He was recently a residential fellow at the Notre Dame Institute of Advanced Studies for the fall of 2013. His forthcoming book with Cambridge University Press is Managing Cyber Attacks in International Law, Business, and Relations in Search of Cyber Peace. His paper today is entitled Cyberconflict and Cybersecurity.
Actually called Sustainable Cybersecurity.
Sustainable Cybersecurity.
That's my bad.
So yeah, both panelists changed the title of their talks. So you go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Cyber is so rapidly changing
Yeah.
to begin with.
Yeah, I've given a number of talks, maybe as many as 12, on the ethics of cyber warfare in the last 2 years or so. In this one, I tried to mix things up a bit. Thus, defending the Chinese, I thought, might be an interesting tack. My questions are just two, although I weave around some other areas. The first is I want to ask a question about whether cyber warfare is distinctive, whether it's a distinctive kind of warfare that involves special, unusual tactics and or deals with different ethical and legal issues. And I'm going to argue fairly extensively that the answer is yes. And then the second question, this is just to sort of pick people, is that I'm going to argue that the Chinese government is in fact innocent of the worst charges of committing cyber attacks against the US. That's not to say they're innocent about everything, it's to say they're innocent of cyber attacks. This question of whether cyber warfare is a new kind of warfare is an interesting one. I'm not particularly well suited to discuss the various ways in which innovations in tactics and weaponry have changed the military. I'm reading a lot at the moment on the Civil War, and I could talk a lot about the cavalry and the uses of the cavalry in the Civil War, but other than that, I'm fairly ignorant. And then the question is whether cyber weapons are a fundamentally new kind of weapon or a mildly different kind of weapon. I want to begin with a kind of odd parallel, and that's between the introductions of nuclear weapons and the introduction of cyber weapons. One thing that's similar in their cases is that both of them, the internet and then nuclear energy, were introduced with both a weapons component and a good for humanity component. The internet was supposed to do wonderful things for us and put all this information at our fingertips. Likewise, many of you don't remember, but the nuclear age had the friendly atom that'll give us power forever and so forth. So they tried to make atomic power friendly. Both of them were weaponized fairly early. Now, a distinction between the two, and this is very marked, is that almost all theorists of nuclear weapons discovered that they were probably too horrible ever to use. So they served as a deterrent, but the people were reluctant actually to use them. Cyber weapons, on the other hand, are likely going to be a weapon that we're going to go to first, because, as I'll argue, they often won't involve massive permanent destruction and killing. So cyber warfare, in the terms of just war theory, is probably not a last resort, whereas nuclear weapons are the very last resort. There's another strong difference between the two. The basic facts of nuclear weaponry were well known in the 50s and 60s, the megatonnage and how they could be the delivery systems was all public knowledge. And there was a massive public and academic debate about nuclear policy. So you have George Kennan, Herman Kahn, Hans Morgenthau, Henry Kissinger, and so forth, along with Thomas Schelling and other theorists talking in the public area about how these weapons are to be used. By comparison, cyber weaponry has been absolutely silent. It's been the actual nature of the weapons is kept super classified, and there's been almost no public debate, certainly not in normal academic debate. So that's a very strong difference. There are a number of problem areas or questions we can ask about cyber warfare, and I divide them up here as definitional, legal, ethical, policy, and technological. I'm only going to be talking about the first three, and even then I'll say fairly little about the legal issues. Oops, I should change this, shouldn't I? In terms of definition, it's important to describe cyber warfare, and I take a modest concept. This is not a definition of cyber war. This is an act of cyber warfare. Now, warfare can take place even if there's not wars. It's intentional harm initiated by a government or political organization. That's to include Al-Qaeda if they want to do something. And it's launched via information processing systems or networks, and it's targeting another government or political organization. So in a metaphor that's crept over from biology, the internet typically is the vector for malware. It's briefly, cyber warfare is intentional nation-on-nation harm via information processing systems. It doesn't necessarily cause deaths or permanent destruction of physical objects. In fact, the 4 or 5 good examples we have of acts of cyber warfare did not involve any deaths at all. Those are Georgia, Estonia, Israel's blinding of the Syrian air defense system, and of course, Stuxnet. There was permanent destruction in the case of Stuxnet, of course, but very limited. In the cases of Georgia and Estonia, there was no permanent damage. Also, interesting to note, 2 of these were non-internet. That is, they weren't malware that went through the internet. Stuxnet is one of those. We think it was, its vector was a thumb drive. As I mentioned, cyber war is not the same thing as acts of cyber warfare. There's been a lively debate about this. A couple of years ago, Richard Clark and Robert Naki came out with a book which dramatized horrible cases of possible cyber warfare with massive deaths and permanent damage. Thomas Rid, in a new and very provocative book, essentially says cyber warfare will not take place. Now, what he means by that is not what I mean by little acts of cyber warfare. He means we're not going to get into a big war in which major cyber powers go after each other for any length of time with significant destruction. We can ask a quick question at this point about what is it about information processing systems and networks that makes cyber warfare possible. Now, this gives a little clue of how we'd get out of it if we were willing to take massive steps. One are that there have to be fairly common operating systems. If every 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 computers had a different operating system, no operator would be able to break into them. They just wouldn't understand the architecture. So it takes Windows or Windows and Apple or Windows and Apple and Linux or whatever. Secondly, the size of our programs are huge. I remember way back in the 80s, I decided to write a word processor for my kid's little VIC-20 it was. And I don't know, it took me hundreds of lines and I had to compress them. And even then it was only moderately functional. The recent software, especially with all its drivers, these are absolutely humongous programs that could not possibly have been written by a single person. And the operating systems are even worse, especially with all the drivers. And then finally, there's the network, or some sort of shareable device that would serve as the vector. So it could be a printer, it could be the network, it could be a LAN, it could be a thumb drive. Eliminate any one of those, and we're not going to have a problem. Disconnect from all other communication with other information systems, you're not going to have a problem. If your programs are fairly small, you just send in an operator to look at the code to see if changes have been made. And with the operating systems, we can be reasonably sure that if you have a proprietary operating system, maybe of your own design, you're not going to get infected by anybody. Now, the legal problems, I'm not an expert in the legal structure, but I've read quite a bit about it. And the main problem in international law is that the way we have talked about just causes of war has generally involved terms like invasion of a sovereign territory, or use or threat of lethal destructive force. That's the language of the UN Charter, Article 2. And then armed aggression is the term. Now, each of those terms has problems when they're applied to cyber warfare. By invasion, we seem to have almost always meant in the past people, soldiers, going across a border, or perhaps just their equipment, but in any case, physical entities, not electromagnetic entities. Armed aggression, that seems to take something called an arm, or arms. A computer is not an arm, it's a general purpose information processing system. So if anything counts as the arms, it's the software or the algorithms, but those are rather spooky things compared to the very metallic guns and artillery pieces. Now, I'm going to grant right away that if death or injury intentionally or foreseeably result from a cyber attack, then it immediately falls into the category of traditional warfare and traditional theories of international law. This is right out of the book we're studying. There are 2 attempts that I know of to sort of say, well, cyber warfare was sort of included in various aspects of international law before it came about. And one is this 1977 additional protocol. And it says development, acquisition, or adoption of a weapon, means, or method of war is, and there's an any missing there, is under an obligation to determine whether its employment would be prohibited. Does anybody know the details of the problem with the additional protocol number 1 and the United States? it's been signed but not ratified. And the book has it exactly correct. So it's been signed but not ratified. This is, I think, a more desperate attempt to say that past international law covers the case of cyber warfare. Michael Schmidt, who's the editor of a very nice piece of work, very, very thoughtful, called the Talon Manual of Cyber Warfare. And it's an attempt to speculate about what the international law governing cyber warfare would be or is. But he reaches into a footnote in an advisory opinion where they talk about other weapons or all other weapons. Other than that, the instances of discussion of weapons seem to refer to the ordinary ones that we knew from long ago. Now, ethics is quite different. It's not the same as the legal. This has come up a number of times in this conference. There are things that are legal or legally obligatory but not ethical. For instance, driving on the right-hand side is a legal obligation if you're a driver, but it's hardly a moral one. There's no basic moral principle that says the right hand is the better side to drive. In ethics, some philosophers have suggested we have a general obligation not to lie or never to lie, but that is not in any legal code I know of. It's only in certain narrowly described circumstances where you will be punished for deceiving or not telling the truth. Ethics has a different sort of architecture as well. It's, at least in one conception of it, it deductively derives from some one basic principle, usually, and then there's debate about what these principles are. I throw in maybe the easiest one to describe, which is minimize harm and maximize good. That's a consequentialist theory. The categorical imperative, which we've heard references, actually, we've heard references to deontological ethics, but the core of the most commonly understood deontological theory is this categorical imperative of Kant. And there are also theories of not violating others' rights. Now, the ethics of war, what's usually called just war theory, goes back to the Romans, who had a very few principles. Cicero enunciated them, but then it really got going with Augustine and Aquinas. And then you might say it was codified very extensively by Hugo Grotius in 1625. And it divides the theory of war into two big parts. One is the theory of when you may justly go to war. That's jus ad bellum. And I've listed the four main conditions there for when a war would be justified. There has to be a just cause, typically an invasion or an attack on you. So that comes back to haunt us in the case of cyber warfare, because it's so unclear what an attack is in that sense. It has to be the last resort. Again, that's a problem with cyber warfare, because it would seem we'd resort to cyber warfare first before we started killing people. Reasonable chance of success and proportionality don't really differentiate the two. Then the second major part of traditional just war theory is this theory of justice in war, jus in bello. And its two main principles are generally regarded as discrimination. Soldiers may not harm those who pose no threat to them, except for certain cases of military necessity. So that's what protects civilians and wounded soldiers and POWs. And proportionality, which is actually a somewhat complicated condition. Now there are some understated problems with just war theory. Although I think it's easily the most widely endorsed theory, it has certain deep theoretical problems. One is that it was formulated by Aquinas, some medieval theologians, and then Grotius, who all believed in a natural rights or natural law theory of ethics. Now, for the last 100 years, no one or very few people have accepted that view of Aristotelian essentialism is what it is. So the main justification for what's now the most popular theory isn't there. It's as if its legs have been kicked out from under it. Now, why it survives is I think it just incorporates a lot of very common sense rules. And also, once these conventions get started, then that might be a good thing in itself to continue them. Second of all, it had a specifically Christian underpinnings. This you might think is odd because many Christian movements these days are anti-war, but the idea of war is also protecting the weak. So say the UN Assembly's obligation to protect is a sort of Christian or altruistic theory. And that was developed even into the nuclear age by Paul Ramsey, although he reverted to another theory. Three, and this is quite odd, 3 and 4 sort of go together. Just war theory as practiced by philosophers utterly ignores game theory, whereas political philosophers, especially in the last, since 1950, have promoted a view called geopolitical realism, or realpolitik. It's associated with Kissinger and others. But the core of that doctrine is widely regarded by philosophers as being totally unacceptable. That's the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. It's disproportionate, it's indiscriminate. It looks like you should never resort to or threaten the total destruction of your opponent, certainly not the civilians. Also, just war theory as it's practiced now, or at least as it's codified by the various militaries, clearly involves some conventions. By that I mean conventions that it's not clear what their moral source is. For instance, there's a St. Petersburg Convention against exploding bullets, but those are only up to a certain grain. Artillery's okay if it explodes. Well, that's a very peculiar and distinction. And also, there's a distinction between hollow bullets and solid bullets. Soldiers must use solid bullets, and hunters may use hollow bullets. So it's those kind of things are more complicated than we might guess, that they're partly historical accidents. Finally, modern just war theories that's practiced these days is quite often based on intuitions. Now I come to now I make my case for the distinctive ethical issues of cyber warfare, and I've already hinted at many of them. The quantity of harm being inflicted on an enemy in a cyber attack is not like that of kinetic weapons. It doesn't result in massive destruction, at least from the cases we've seen. And the quality of harm is quite different. Again, in the cases we've seen, there have been no deaths and no massive personal destruction. That's one of the things that I think has created the principles of just war theory, is usually it results in many, many unexpected deaths and destruction of huge areas, causing starvation and so forth. Well, cyber warfare, insofar as we can see the kinds of acts that are going to be permitted in the next 10 or 20 years, probably isn't like that at all. This would affect the two conditions of last resort and proportionality. There are some peculiar epistemic aspects of cyber warfare. Often we may not know in real time who has attacked us. That's very strange. I've been asking military historians whether there's any case in the history of warfare where they knew they received a massive attack but didn't know from whom. And it seems very rare. Whereas in cyber warfare, this is going to be more the rule than the exception. Lastly, cyber warfare in terms of cyber security, cyber defense, as it were, is now and is going to be very, very expensive. It now costs tens, maybe in the high tens of billions of dollars a year to shield our industries and government computers, and it's expected to go into the hundreds of billions of dollars very soon. So this is a massive outlay of funds that can only go up. This is why Cyber Command's getting funded while all the other elements of the Department of Defense are being cut. The ethical aspects of cyber warfare, this is sort of a chart for a whole other paper. Almost everybody, including myself, has talked about only the aspects that are somewhat like the damage caused by traditional warfare. But there are other considerations. For one thing, cyber warfare is more like the damage that's caused by sanctions, in that it can damage an economy but not destroy it. Well, there is no morality, so far as I know, of sanctions, and which sanctions are worse or better than others. The general principle has been that any form of sanction is better than going to war, and so it doesn't matter. But I would guess sanctions are very problematic morally, and very little thought has been given to what forms of software cause the most harm and what cause the least. There are also aspects of its effect on a nation's citizens and on third parties. Cyber warfare frequently takes place by pivots or by botnets that are actually located in a third country. So just for example, China attacks us, but they do so through servers in the Ukraine or Nigeria. And that's where we see the attack coming from, perhaps that country. I've argued in another paper that we might in some cases be justified in intervening in those computers in the third-party nations, but that's a long story. And finally, some of the botnets that cause the worst attacks on the US are coming from your grandmother's computer that hasn't been patched for 10 or 15 years. And a really robust cyber defense would require us to sort of call up the cybersecurity police and go around and check to see who houses that botnet and who doesn't. Neil Rowe, a very well-known computer scientist and one of the major figures in the theory of cyber warfare, has suggested that cyber warfare what makes cyber warfare wrong is that it involves perfidy. Now, it turns out that's probably not correct. I haven't met anyone who knows the terminology who agrees that it's perfidy. Perfidy is a very unusual case in which there are laws of war and you deliberately exploit them. So if you put armed soldiers in a Red Cross truck, that's perfidy. If you hide weapons under your jacket and go toward the enemy with a white flag and then pull them out, that's perfidy. And that's because there are these conventions that are part of the law of war of what you can do. If anything, what's going on in hacking is something more like deception. So hacking into a system almost always is pretending to be someone else, an authorized user. Now, the question is, Is that degree of moral deception wrong, and how wrong is it? Well, I suspect it's not very wrong, and it's not so clear that it's wrong at all. Hardly any websites have the statement, "are authorized users only." DoD sites do typically, but the bank sites don't. I've actually scanned through all the Amazon and so forth. And there's no warning. There's no citation of a penalty like we get on DVDs, that the FBI will come after you. There's no promise by the user that I agree by entering this site to abide by the rules of the owner of the site. And in fact, deception is widely practiced in international relations and tolerated. Imagine if Putin couldn't say that some of those soldiers were Russian. We just shrug our shoulders at such things. And lastly, in military ethics, deceptions in the forms of ruses and feints are widely accepted tactics. Well, what are they then? Well, hacking into a system is some sort of intrusion. I would argue against it being literal intrusion, because it's not entering into any sort of space. I then go through an example. I'll just sketch it very briefly. I've tried actually for years to find a moral analogy of what it is like to hack into a system, and I came up with kind of an ugly but simple example, and that is going into a grocery store. The door is open. It has a sign that says open. That's like putting up a website that others may enter. Some parts of it you can go into, some parts they don't want you to. It's very unclear what the laws are. In Europe, for example, you dare not pick up the fruit yourself. Whereas in the US, that you're going to wait a long time to get your fruit if you don't pick it up yourself. And those are very, very custom-based, what you may do. Children are generally not desired in porcelain shops, etc. Sometimes there will be signs, don't pick it up. These are sort of vast sets of conventions that seem to go with going into a grocery store, and a grocery store is a kind of public-private interface. You're welcome to go in if you do certain things. Which things? Well, the things that the store owner wants you to do. Now let's come back. I'll conclude just by defending the poor Chinese. First of all, General Keith Alexander and many others, this is the most common report, is that the Chinese attack us or have launched cyber attacks, many of them, sometimes thousands an hour. Almost all of these attacks are just probes at getting into the system. And even those that get in are mostly just espionage. So there are rumors of some classified cases where the Chinese have gone in and destroyed things. But mostly what seems to be pissing people off is that they've gone in and taken information. Now, espionage has never been seen as a cause of war. You can do massive espionage. Now, your spies may be caught and punished, but the nation isn't attacked. And think of what it would be like. Actually, what the Chinese are doing are much like what satellites do. They spy on you. Well, would any amount of spying by a satellite be a cause for war? Would you call that an attack if a radar-based satellite is examining the shape of your house? I don't think so. The other case has to do with intellectual property, the theft of intellectual property. Well, that's a very complicated legal business, actually, that's only been sorted out well in the last 100 years and is almost entirely regulated by various trade agreements and treaties. And so they don't seem to be violating any laws there either. Otherwise, we'd be taking them to the WTO. Okay. Sorry, I went on a little. Do you want-
People do questions at the end.
Okay, good.
Poor Chinese.
I hope there wasn't a recording here.
I'll just ignore that, you know. It was actually great. I had 2 classes last week, and I forgot to log out in between them. And when I came back in the classroom, somebody written down a giant notice, "You call yourself a cybersecurity expert," and they forced me to log out. So yeah, indeed. Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to be back at Notre Dame in the land of inclement weather. Much better to be here in April than in December. That was a little bleak there for a while. Thank you so much to the Reilly Center. Thank you especially, Don Howard, for this wonderful invitation. It's an honor and a privilege to be here with all of you today. I thought I would just say a quick word of context so you know where I'm coming from with this topic, because it's a little bit different from, I think, a few other folks in the room. That's how I got interested in this stuff, right? It was back in 2007. The year the iPhone came out, back in the dark ages, right? This was also the year, as you might recall, of the cyber riot, quote unquote, in Estonia. That got me interested in the role of the public and private sectors in managing cyber attacks, originally under international law, but I've since kind of expanded outward, as we'll talk a little bit about. I got so interested that, Lord help me, I decided to write the book that was mentioned on this topic. It was supposed to be due out right around Christmas time. I'm sure it would have been a huge stocking stuffer if it would have been there, but it's got pushed back, life intervened. It's now coming out in June. It's really organized around this concept of cyber peace and what that might mean and how we may be able to get there. As part of that exploration, I've been exploring the roles of different stakeholders and how they can, for example, spread cybersecurity best practices and promote human rights. So I've done kind of a slew of articles, some of which have gone into the book as well, on the role, for example, of national governments in internet governance, the role of technical communities in addressing vulnerabilities in the internet architecture, and looking at stuff like comparative cybersecurity best practices, like the role of risk insurance and some of the moral hazard stuff there. We can talk about that if anybody's interested as well. My emphasis today in particular builds from that latter work of how businesses can promote cyber peace, right? By looking at how they can spread best practices through positive network effects and help build this idea of civic virtue, right? This notion of creating cultures of engagement both within organizations and then broader still, right? Most of the work there has been done in the sustainability context, hence the title of the talk, Sustainable Cybersecurity, right? So I'll be drawing from some of the concepts and some of the tools that have really grown up as part of the green movement and try to apply them to see how they might help us think through addressing contemporary cybersecurity challenges. So you can kind of think of it as an application of the really able framework that Randy just laid for us. Now we can maybe apply that to addressing some contemporary challenges, particularly from the private sector perspective. You can see how I'll try to organize things as follows. I'll start off by saying just a few words about the very multifaceted cyber threat. That's well-trodden ground, so I'm not going to belabor that point. We'll go through that stuff pretty quickly. We'll then pivot to talk about what cyber peace is, how we can get there, such as through this framework of polycentric governance you see on the screen there, that was made famous by, or at least in some circles, right, so the weird academic circles in which I travel, by the late, great Professor Eleanor Ostrom, who you might heard of, and some of her collaborators. Then I'll drill down a little bit more on CSR in particular and sustainability generally before transitioning then finally to talk about, all right, how can we apply this to addressing cyber attacks through best practices from the bottom up, and how does this relate in turn to building out a law of cyber peace? What does it mean for policymakers, in other words? I hope that sounds somewhat interesting. I am all that stands between you and cocktails and dinner, so I will not go on very long at all, but please do feel free to interrupt if you have any questions or if you'd like to drill in or get out of a topic sooner rather than later. I thought I would just start with a word of context, right? Because it's helpful to think a little more broadly about what we're talking about here, right? This term cyberspace It's only been around since the 80s. It comes to us from a sci-fi novel. I'm sure you're familiar with, some of you at least, right? It's called Neuromancer. It's just an okay book, but it clearly had legs, right? And we're still debating about what this term means even to this day. Is this an extension of national territory, for example? Of course, we know that the physical infrastructure of the internet is located in sovereign jurisdictions, so of course they can exercise control over this. But is there something separate from that as well? Is there this notion still of a global network commons, to use former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's phrase, right? Is it a bit of both? Is it a pseudo-commons or an imperfect commons, to use Professor Joseph Nye's language, right? And as a result, especially as we think about the sustainability context, is it amenable to some sort of a tragedy of the cyber commons, right? What would that look like? The Congress, for example, put out a report talking about spam as a form of information pollution that could lead to a tragedy of the cyber commons. There's been some research on DDoS attacks as well as being degrading websites through overuse and being a form of a tragedy as well. That gets us to think through solutions, right? The classic solutions to the tragedy of the commons you might be familiar with, right? One is nationalization, so Big Brother steps in, right? Otherwise, we privatize it. We parcel up the pie, everybody gets a slice. Now, one of the reasons Professor Ellen Rostrom won the Nobel Prize a few years ago was that she showed there was a third way, which I'll talk about, and we'll try to apply that to cybersecurity here in just a second. First, though, this is a chart that Cisco put together a few years ago. I just thought it was worth showing because it illustrates the fact that there's not a lot of agreement on what we mean by cyberspace, even amongst countries that you think would share a lot in common, culturally, maybe even ethically, right? So this is a chart basically showing the US, Five Eyes, EU, plus a few other organizations. Even between those groups, look how broadly cyberspace is being conceptualized, right? It's really all over the map, which makes it difficult as we think through internet governance, right? Now, this is an oversimplification, this slide, right? It's not just the case where there's a group of countries that profess internet sovereignty and a group that like internet freedom. There's a lot of overlap there, right? But it is worth noting that there are certain countries, if we think of it more of a spectrum, that do prefer a larger role for the state in governance and security, which impacts how we think the role the private sector should be, what we think the role of the state should be in enhancing cybersecurity. And of course, there's other countries like the US historically that prefers this idea of internet freedom, this networked commons, right? With certain rights like free speech and free assembly, sacrosanct, though of course there's plenty of ways that we censor in the states as well, right? So it's not a perfect comparison there. You can compare this freedom on the net map, though, to another map you probably have seen before. This is from WICIT 2012, right? The World Conference on International Telecommunications. This was a big conference, semi-controversial, a few years ago in December, that basically came to loggerheads in part because of non-binding language inserted into one of the international telecommunication regulations about a larger role for the state in internet governance, right? Those countries in red, again, oversimplification, but those are the countries that refuse to sign, so you can kind of think of this as the internet freedom camp, right? The countries in black are those countries that did sign on to it, right? Keep note, though, this is a pre-Snowden map, right? This was back in 2012. So I think it would look a little bit differently today. Brazil is probably going to be a different color, right? But I wanted to bring it up because this provides a little bit of context for thinking through how do we regulate this thing called cyberspace? What modalities do we bring to bear? Law is one of them, but of course there's others, right? And it's also important to talk about because I'm sure some of you are familiar with this. Just this week in Brazil, starting tomorrow, in fact, we have a global multi-stakeholder conference starting, right? If you're not familiar, just Google Global Multi-Stakeholder Conference, Brazil. You can actually stream it live. Don't do it during the conference tomorrow. Wait till Thursday. Wait till all the presentations are done. Come here, of course. But it's worthwhile to note that, right? It could be nothing. It could be a continuation of the status quo. But maybe the stars are aligned for things to change a bit this time because of the support of emerging markets like Brazil, but also like Germany, and because of organizations like ICANN that are behind an effort to change how the internet is governed, right? So this is just kind of prologue to get us thinking about the wider context of the role of the state and the role of the private sector in managing this thing called cyberspace, right? So now just to delve into the well-trodden ground bit, right? We all know a fair amount, I think, about cyber attacks, or at least we see them in the news all the time. There's not just one definition out there. I actually prefer the National Academy's definition. It's not just because Herb is sitting in the room, all the others, but I actually like it because it's really broad, really multifaceted. They defined it in 2009 as efforts to alter, disrupt, or destroy computer systems or networks or the informations or programs on them, which I think is illustrative of all the different components that go into the cyber threat. Of course, these things aren't new, right? They've been around at least since November 2nd, 1988, when a Cornell graduate student infected MIT's network with the first logic bomb, right? Which is actually a pretty funny story since he's now a dot-com millionaire as well as a professor, right? So things didn't work out too poorly for the world's first cyber attacker. If you believe it, states have been using versions of these attacks even longer, at least since the early 1980s. More than 30 years, in other words, before Stuxnet, Aurora, or Heartbleed, or the others that we hear about so consistently. How widespread is the cyber threat today? Nobody knows. Nobody really knows. Why don't we have a better sense of it, right? A couple of issues going on here. First, few entities are asking or demanding for information from companies about the cyber attacks that they're facing. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, now requires publicly traded firms to disclose cyber attacks that have a material impact on their finances. Plenty of companies haven't been doing that, though, right? The EU is moving even more aggressively in that direction, so we're going toward a more robust disclosure regime, but we're not there yet. Voluntarily, of course, companies don't want to transmit this data because it can open them up to very legitimate liability concerns. And the NIST framework that we can talk about if anybody's interested could help or hinder that. It just came out a few months ago. And of course, there's also a perceived lack of competence in law enforcement there, right? Who exactly do we contact about this? Are we confident that they're going to investigate and come to a conclusion? We do have some new tools, though. Maybe they're not super helpful, but at least they're pretty cool to get us a better handle on how widespread the threat is. You might have seen this map before as well. We'll see if it works. We'll see if the link works. If not, that's okay. We'll, of course, ignore the security features that are on the bottom of the screen there. That's right? It doesn't look like it's going to work. It's basically a disturbing lava lamp, right? It's showing cyber attacks happening in real time around the world. It's put out by Kaspersky Labs. So for those of you with computers, if you just go to cybermap.kaspersky.com, you can get it as well, right? But it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. It's a fun screensaver, if nothing else. Hopefully your computer doesn't light up as one of them kind of while it's on there. But it does show some things. For example, the most infected nation in the world. Any guesses? Number one right now, according to Kaspersky? Right now, we're number two. Hey, number two. That's pretty good, right? Russia was number one, according to that most recent, at least when I checked this morning, at least, right? But it does vary. You're absolutely right. Day to day there. So that's just a fun thing to check out there. So what's different now, though, isn't the fact that these attacks are happening, but the fact that they're proliferating in numbers, sophistication, and severity, and the fact that they're targeting companies and countries alike. It's easy to throw your hands up and lose perspective as a result of that, right? And practitioners aren't immune to that either. Jim Lewis at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, for example, has said, we have a faith-based approach to cybersecurity, and that we pray every night nothing bad will happen. And I think that's pretty accurate, unfortunately, of a lot of kind of where we're at right now. Now, there's a lot of popular ways to conceptualize this problem. Oftentimes, we break it down into categories, right? We have cyber war, we have cyber crime, terrorism, and espionage. We've already touched on cyber war a fair amount, so I'm not going to belabor that, except to note that we haven't really seen a pure cyber war yet, right? We've seen cyber attacks used in international armed conflict, like the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, and I think it's absolutely right that future international armed conflicts will also have a cyber component, right? But regardless, it's important for firms to take note because more than 90% of critical infrastructure in the States is in private hands, right? So of course that's going to be targets potentially in a future cyber conflict, which is why Frank Montoya, a U.S. counterintelligence official, has said, we're an information-based society now. Information is everything. That makes company executives the front line in determining what comes, right? So it's important, in other words, to pay attention to what the private sector is doing because there's a lot of best practices happening there. Cyber crime, there's many facets to that, of course, from identity theft to fraud. Like Randy, I care most about theft of intellectual property, right? Particularly trade secrets. If you look at the Fortune 500 companies, many of them, 2/3 of their value are tied into their trade secrets. So it's a big deal to protect them, not only for individual companies, but for economies built on innovation, right? How well are we doing? Well, again, we don't know. We don't know. If you look at the data on trade secrets theft or cybercrime generally, it's really all over the map. You see estimates, for example, of $1 trillion lost to cyber criminals in 2010. That would dwarf the global market in illegal drugs, but take it with a grain of salt, right? For example, Javelin once did a cybercrime survey and based their estimates on just 7 responses, right? And they called that was the survey at the time. So they're imperfect, but they're all we have to go on oftentimes. What's our response been to cybercrime? According to the Department of Justice, prosecutions are up over 400% since 2005. So we're going after more of these guys. But of course, the global dimension to cybercrime makes prosecution, makes jurisdiction difficult. We have a treaty, Council of Europe's Convention on Cybercrime, also called the Budapest Convention. Convention, right? But it's hampered by two big things. One, only 42 nations have ratified it, at least the last time that I looked. And two, states can decline to cooperate on pretty broad grounds, which illustrates some of the difficulty in relying on international law alone to help build this idea of cyber peace. Espionage, as has been already mentioned, of course, legal under international law. This isn't always even illegal under domestic law. We don't even have one definition of trade secrets in the US, right? So it shouldn't come as no surprise then that how we regulate this internationally really differs. What we think of as trade secrets theft in the US oftentimes, perfectly legal in Canada, in France, to say nothing of China, right? So that's difficult to regulate, to say the least. Cyber terrorism, of course, most terrorist groups have used the internet typically for recruiting, financing, public relations. There's been some hypotheses for why more terrorist groups don't use it for true, what you could think of as cyber terrorism. Maybe it's a lack of technological sophistication. On that point, former Director of National Intelligence, Mike McConnell, has a comforting thought. Sooner or later, terror groups will achieve cyber sophistication. He says, it's like nuclear proliferation, only far easier. That's a bummer. Right, that's definitely a bummer. So now that we've unpacked this a little bit, what are we supposed to do other than unplug and stockpile canned goods, right? The key thing that I want you to take away from this slide is that these categories really overlap, right? So what do you do, for example, about a state-sponsored cyber attack involving a criminal organization to conduct economic espionage? Happens all the time, happens every day. How do you classify that? How do you move the ball forward then, right? So instead of worrying about categorizing this stuff, a lot of my research these days, and plenty of others as well, is moving toward how we think about managing vulnerabilities, such as from the bottom up, to build toward this idea of cyber peace, right? First off, what do I mean by cyber peace? I did not come up with this term. I first read about this a couple years ago. This is from a Vatican report that was put out also by the World Federation of Scientists and the ITU, International Telecommunication Union. It defines cyber peace as a universal order of cyberspace built on a wholesome state of tranquility, the absence of disorder or disturbance and violence. That sounds good. Let's do that. Right? I like that too. Sounds great. I just wasn't convinced that that was possible, so I put that question of what cyber peace could be to folks I was interviewing for the book, and I got back some fun responses. Michael Dubose, who used to head up the Department of Justice Cybercrime Division, said to me, cyber peace to me would be an entire weekend without my BlackBerry going off, which I kind of like, right? Kind of like that as well. So cyber peace to me is also not the absence of attacks or exploitations. We could think about that as negative cyber peace, right? Be great, but it's not going to happen. Rather, I'm arguing for a more positive vision of cyber peace that simplifies and kind of builds from the list of principles you see on the screen there. Particularly does three things: respects human rights, spreads internet access along with cybersecurity best practices, and also strengthens multi-stakeholder governance over the internet, right? With the idea being that even if we can't stop cyber attacks, we can manage them more effectively, such as by taking a networked and distributed approach to a networked and distributed problem, in the words of Robert Nackey, right? How do we get there? That's where this framework comes in. We've been playing a little bit with this idea of polycentric governance. We talked about democratization of technology this morning, right? This is kind of a vein of that a little bit. This is a gross oversimplification on the screen, right? This is actually quite a multifaceted concept that's really been built up over decades. It's been applied to everything from urban crime to primary schooling to climate change. So seriously, this concept has some legs to it. But for our purposes, you can think of it as starting small, starting local, but starting somewhere to address big global problems, right? Toward the end of her career, Professor Ostrom was applying it to climate change. I'm trying to apply the same framework to cyber attacks in particular. That kind of has some echoes of subsidiarity and emergence here, in that there's a lot that can be done in terms of self-organization to help kind of, for example, spread best practices from the bottom up. But it's not without its problems, right? In particular, if you talk about this purely bottom-up approach, fragmentation, gridlock, you can think of the others, right? There's even an application of Garrett Hardin's lifeboat ethics that you could talk about with regard to this if anybody's interested. So, that is just a little bit of a framework to think about there. As we hone in on businesses now and think about how they can, for example, apply corporate social responsibility to enhancing their cybersecurity best practices, a few things come to mind. First, this has begun to be called for from the top down. Howard Schmidt, who used to be the cybersecurity coordinator for the US, has called on critical infrastructure firms to do exactly this, right? To treat cybersecurity as part of their corporate social responsibility, because so many companies rely on critical infrastructure companies to keep the lights on, to keep the water running, right? Some companies are taking note. Even Google, for example, now has an initiative, you might want to Google this for what it's worth, called Project Shield. All right? Project Shield is to help protect NGOs from government censorship. It's also to kind of promote this internet freedom agenda that we talked about. Facebook is doing some similar stuff, but of course it's a double-edged sword with some of the best censorship technologies in the world being developed in Silicon Valley, right? So there's a little bit of both going on at the same time. The trick is how we can leverage the power of these small groups to the public benefit. And there's a lot of ways that companies can benefit, right? Some of it are pretty widely appreciated in the literature at this point. Of course, it can help with economic development, rule of law, helping with corruption. Two-track diplomacy is an interesting one, right? For example, General Electric had a positive role, you could argue, in the India-Pakistan nuclear standoff. Are we seeing the same thing now in the cybersecurity context? I don't know. Right? For example, some tech companies are helping to influence the shape of U.S. surveillance practices, so maybe we are. Also, community engagement, which brings us back to the CSR idea, which is just one component, though, of sustainability, right? So sustainability is a really big, multifaceted concept. I teach a couple courses on it, so I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but we know the basics, I think, that there's different dimensions to sustainability. There's an economic dimension, right? An environmental dimension, and however you want to talk about it, social, governance, whatever the case may be. Depending on where you're sitting in the world, one of those dimensions is more important than the others. A lot of emerging markets, economic development is the most important. For us, we typically think of environmental protection. We don't have time to go through the evolution, really, of the sustainability movement. I'll just note that it got its start, at least a modern version here in the States, right? Through the work of grassroots organizers in response to works like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, right? And really, the sorry state of environmental affairs, from pesticide use to rivers catching on fire, not too far from here. Things weren't looking too good, in other words, right? That led to the first Earth Day, right? Now we're celebrating another. That led to eventually a slew of environmental laws being passed. Starting more recently, we've seen the private sector really take on the torch, right? We don't see the big comprehensive laws coming from Congress anymore, but we do see for example, some surveys showing that 93% of CEOs now say that sustainability is critical to the future success of their companies. Why do they say that? It's not just cost savings. The big three motivating factors there are brand, trust, and reputation. And I only bring that up because those are some of the same factors that come up when we think about why firms are paying more attention to cybersecurity, especially after Target, right? And some of the breaches that happened there recently, including impact on brand and consumer trust. Now, the private sector has developed a whole range of tools here to help green, right? To help make things more sustainable. I just put up a few examples. We don't have to go through them in any detail. You see the first one up there, integrated reporting. This is just simply the idea that instead of just disclosing your financial statements each year, think more broadly about the impact of your company, right? On the environment, on surrounding communities, whatever the case may be. There's different frameworks to do that. The most popular one is the Global Reporting Initiative, because literally thousands of companies are doing that at this point, including the majority of the Fortune 500. More countries are regulating it. 33 countries now regulate integrated reporting, including the US. If you're listed on the stock exchange in South Africa, you have to do it, right? So we're moving toward a more robust disclosure regime for the sustainability context. And interestingly, we see similar clamoring, especially on the part of investors, for more information on cybersecurity from companies, right? So more companies are also disclosing their preparedness as part of their integrated reports, which we may see move further along, especially with new SEC guidelines that are expected. There's certification programs as well. I think we're familiar with the LEED program, right, from the U.S. Green Building Council to think about how green different buildings are. It could be platinum, it could be gold, right? Well, there's a potential there to have the same thing to identify firms with best-in-class cybersecurity, right? And the Heritage Foundation has actually put out a report suggesting exactly that for securing supply chains. And there's a lot of different environmental and international law that we could bring in. You can guess how polluter pays would apply to cybersecurity, right? Or common but differentiated responsibilities. The common heritage of mankind is a popular one in other areas of the global commons, kind of quote unquote, right? But it comes with a lot of political baggage, which is why we see it moving toward more sustainable development these days, right? So we're starting to apply some of these concepts to cybersecurity. We got a long way to go though, right? We still haven't had a cyber silent spring to help kind of galvanize this stuff, right? Maybe one of you hopefully can write it. I certainly won't be able to. So thinking more broadly about sustainability and moving toward applying some of these concepts, right, especially best practices, I'll just wind up here with just a few examples. There's a lot that we can choose from, right? If we think about it particularly from the bottom up, hardware, right? For example, Microsoft did a study last year that found vulnerabilities, found exploits actually being installed on PC production lines before they left the factory. So clearly, securing supply chains would really help. That's easier said than done, though, right? And being mindful of the extended enterprise. The Heartbleed bug, of course, shows us the importance of focusing on protocols. Domain name system is inherently insecure. A lot of us know that. There's a fix out there, but it does cost something to implement, and plenty of companies haven't bothered. Of course, improving code, right? That's an important step forward. Certain companies, are norm entrepreneurs doing exactly that. Certain jurisdictions, though, are also moving in that direction. The EU has debated strict liability, actually, for programmers, which could be quite an aggressive step forward, to say the least. And we can all do better, right? We can all use stronger passwords. We know that. We know we're not supposed to pick up the free flash drives, right? When we use public Wi-Fi, at least use onion routing. That kind of stuff can really make a big difference. The kind of next level up is what companies can do, right? The main takeaway for this is that companies are predominantly reactive at this point, right? It hits the wall after a major data breach, and they don't know exactly what to do in the aftermath. So it pays big time to be more proactive and to invest in these best practices from the beginning. I just put up a few up there. There's unfortunately, of course, no technological magic bullet, right? But definitely technologies can help, from deep packet inspection to biometrics. You can't spend our way to cybersecurity, unfortunately. That'd be great, but it's just not going to happen. Infinite investment doesn't breed in infinite security, but it can help. The average in the States is about 5% of IT budgets being spent on cybersecurity, right? To put that in perspective, the US government spends about 11%, right? So it's a bit of a disjoint there. And organization can help too, right? Organization can help too, of course. More firms are also mitigating the risk through cyber risk insurance that I mentioned just in passing earlier. So big benefits. If you're a small or medium-sized enterprise, you're just out the deductible, which could be great. If we incentivize it as a matter of policy, though, then it could arguably make firms more reactive, right? Which enters into this moral hazard issue that we talked about before. But it still is a favorite, and you can see how rapidly the cyber risk insurance industry is expanding, going up tenfold since 2003. Shockingly, Congress hasn't done a lot with regards to cybersecurity. I think we all know that. That's left the executive branch, particularly recently the Obama administration, in charge of implementing some fixes here. The most interesting one we've seen recently is, of course, the executive order from February 2013 that, among other things, put out the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is a voluntary framework, quote unquote, for critical infrastructure companies, right? There's a lot of incentives in place to help firms decide to choose to go with this framework. And over time, especially because of liability concerns, maybe we're going to see this become more mandatory de facto, even if it's not mandatory as a matter of law. It's kind of interesting as well. I've been talking to some of the NIST folks, and they're having an active dialogue with their counterparts in the EU, right? The EU is also going through a pretty dramatic change in its cybersecurity policy making, looking a lot more aggressively than we've talked about in the States. For example, it would require regular audits for cybersecurity preparedness for publicly traded companies, a lot of companies. It would impose liability even if the cybersecurity is outsourced, and require the notification of national authorities in the event of a cyber attack or a data breach. So we kind of see basically a governance spectrum emerging then. We do see some countries like the US, like the UK, like Australia and India taking a more market-driven, kind of a voluntary approach toward enhancing cybersecurity. You see some of the usual suspects up there as well, taking this more state-centric approach, right? It's not totally clear. The jury's out on which is going to be best at the end of the day. You can guess what the downsides are of going with a purely state-driven approach, civil liberties, innovation, right? But a purely voluntary approach isn't exactly straightforward either. We have more than 3,200 independent power providers in the States, right? Germany has 4. So it's a little bit easier to get 4 companies on the same page than 3,200, even as it does promote more space for innovation and experimentation for that matter. No nation is an island in cyberspace, so of course I could have spent the entire time on the international law, and I'd be happy to talk more about that as well. I think there's a growing consensus, it's fair to say, that of course the law of armed conflict applies to those cyber attacks above the armed attack threshold. Problem is that's an extremely small percentage of attacks, right? So what do we do about the other 99%? That's that laundry list you see on the side of the screen there, right? And that's, for what it's worth, what Michael Schmidt and some others are working on now, Talon 2.0, below the threshold, I think they're calling it, right? And there's a laundry list of some ideas up there, from the law of countermeasures There are different analogies we can look to, and some other ideas, right? For example, the law on bilateral investment treaties is pretty underappreciated. There's more than 3,000 of these treaties around the world, and the more recent ones include trade secrets protections, right? So for example, you could have an investor-state arbitration to provide a forum to hear grievances. So that's just one idea. This is definitely a patchwork, but it could help move the ball forward here. So just to quickly summarize, because I know I've been droning on for way too long, and I apologize for that. Thinking through this means that we need to do a couple things. First, corporations should definitely pay attention to what information they're getting from, of course, governments, and vice versa, though. For example, Australia was able to decrease the incidence of cyber attacks on its networks by 85%. 85% reportedly, by doing just three things, right? First, application whitelisting, so having a list of pre-approved programs running on government networks, right? Not exactly rocket science. Two, automatic updating for critical software and operating systems. And three, minimizing local admin privileges. So pretty low-hanging fruit, but that can still take us, I think, in a pretty productive direction. So I think there's more and more buy-in for this voluntary bottom-up approach, but we need to leverage the insights we're getting from the private sector to do that and to promote this idea of cyber peace. And I think CSR and sustainability can be one vehicle to help get us there. So went on for way too long. I think I'll wind up there, but I welcome, and I'm sure Randy would as well, any questions that you may have. So thank you again for this opportunity.
Okay, looks like we have about 23 minutes left for questions. Or we can just go for cocktails right now.
I think there's one here. Yep.
Okay, Scott, you were citing Eleanor Ostrom and her work on common pool resources as an analogy to cyber security issues.
Right.
One of the points that Eleanor is making in that work, and there's several, is that you do have a public goods problem. And that public goods problem can sometimes be resolved on a local level by local responses. In discussing cybersecurity issues, you have not really worked through the localized responses that you see in particular neighborhoods. Financial, for example, have come up with their own standards for trying to defend. Okay. And you also haven't talked about transnational networks, including network exchange operators, who are seeking to come up with methods of addressing the cyber commons problems. Could you tell us a little bit, before cocktails, before we get too depressed, about the prospects for, let's call them localized responses to elements of the problem, and more broadly to whether the arrogant internet exchange operators and their claims of being able to handle the problems are, in your view, right or wrong?
That's a great question. Yeah, I didn't go on too long for the polycentric governance stuff because I don't know if interested folks would be on it, but I'd be happy to talk a little more about it now. We can talk for sure more later as well. You're absolutely right. I think it's safe to say, and for those that don't know, this framework really grew up from local issues, right? How do we manage forests and lakes and harbors and fisheries more effectively, right? And for that matter, crime in urban areas like Indianapolis. They did some early studies there back in the 60s and 70s. And in the field, they were able to show that actually local groups do a decent job at self-organizing across different contexts. Not always, but they do a decent job, right? So you're absolutely right then. Applying that same idea to the internet, this network of 3 billion users, is difficult, to say the least. We're not talking about villagers surrounding a local lake, right? We're talking about something much, much larger in the oceans of cyberspace, right? So I think there are some insights that can be applied there. For example, she developed that IAD framework, this institution analysis and design framework, and some of the elements of that do kind of map on, but they also show the limitations of applying this framework to deal exclusively with cybersecurity, right? So for example, having a defined user pool and being able to practice enforcement, right, to figure out issues of the open access as a result of that. That's really tough to pull off. So I think the ideal system would, of course, have to have some combination of this bottom-up and top-down response, but that's the million-dollar question. It's really tough to define how that would look like and how we get there, right? So I think we're at the very just beginning stages. That basically, that field work hasn't happened yet in the cyber context, but I would be very interested in trying to begin to do some of that, because it's a whole area that needs a lot more work. I think that's fair to say.
I wanted to go back to something that Randy said in the beginning, and it's more of a comment than a question. He asks the question: has there been an instance in kinetic war where we haven't been able to attribute very well? And I would agree that the number of instances where that's been true is very, very small. Nonetheless, a very interesting and recent example is the Russian activity in Crimea, right? Where you have people who are clearly Russian troops running around, just not in marked uniforms. Now, if the issue were, what that did was, no, I don't think anybody seriously doubts that they're Russian, okay? So we know where it's coming from. But the fact that the fact that you don't get pictures of Russian troops, of overtly Russian troops there, paralyzes the world's reaction, and creates a kind of ambiguity and confusion and deception about the activities there. That sort of paralyzes a response. Now, it seems to me that many of the same things apply to cyber as well. It may not be so much the actual knowing who it is as the inability to provide definitive photographic quality proof. Now, I don't have any. This is not a question; it's more of an observation. But there are. We apparently don't know how to deal very well with non-attribution in physical space and physical conflict as well. So the same comments apply. If you had a reaction, I'd be curious, but it's just an observation.
In the cyber attack on Estonia, which was largely denial of service, temporary, the Russians said those were not under the control of the government, that they were patriotic hackers. And China has used that defense occasionally too. And it's apparent that you can disguise and perhaps stimulate groups to act on behalf of the government who aren't necessarily directly under the control of the government. Yeah.
Could I venture a comment? Somewhere between a comment and a question, if I might. I'd like to put together a common thread in your two talks with some points that have been made in discussion, especially earlier today. So, Randy, you emphasize the difficulty of accommodating cyber conflict under existing ethical, legal, and just war theory frameworks. Scott, you emphasize the extraordinary challenge of figuring out how to norm the space of cyber conflict and cybersecurity in response to the kind of challenge, partly that Randy is sketching. We're working in a space here that really does pose serious challenges about how you norm this mode of conflict. I want to put that feature of your talks together with this comment that was made a couple of times in Q&A earlier today, and especially after Ken and Michael's session, about the contrast between the SynBio community, which seems unusually proactive and engaged with the ethics issues, and a cyber technical community that seems, by contrast, remarkably disengaged from the ethics issues. I have a personal interest in the question how you bring the cyber technical community into the enterprise, the need for which and the difficulty of which you guys are sketching here. I gave a talk at a cybersecurity conference in Australia this summer where I proposed a cyber pugwash movement as one idea, to bring the sub-policy level technical specialists together in protected spaces to begin talking about the technical side of this, just one desperate idea. But I'd be curious to get your thoughts on whether there is a role and what is the role for the technical cyber community in trying to address these challenges.
Yeah, well, just two quick responses to that from my end. Yeah, I think that's a really important and a difficult question, right? So we have, I think, seen some responses of technical communities, for example, self-organizing after one of these big breaches to help spread, for example, best practices. A recent one was just the retail sector in the aftermath of the Target attack, right? Now they're deciding to share cyber threat information amongst the retail sector, kind of mirroring a little bit what the ISACs do for critical infrastructure sectors. So that you could argue maybe that's going to be progress. Is that enough to actually infuse ethics within that discussion, or is it just a discussion of, hey, how do we keep out the next cyber attackers? I think it's probably more the latter for now, but the hope is that as those conversations begin to take place, maybe they will broaden out a little bit. We can, of course, do more to help with that as well. I'm sure many of us are familiar with some of the regulatory barriers in place that prevent or make it difficult for companies to share cyber attack data with one another, bottom up and top down. So to the extent that we can help ease some of that burden, I think that could just help with that type of effort in the future. It's just off the top of my head.
The 1,000-pound gorilla in the cybersecurity of the U.S. is NSA. They have long claimed that they see many attacks coming, and by statute, they're not allowed to share them with private. Now, of course, I mean, 2 years ago, General Alexander went to DEF CON in his jeans. Last year, he was forbidden from going. No federal official was encouraged.
He was right before, so he actually Black Hat DEF CON we back to back because he
Yeah.
won. So he showed up at DEF CON 2 years ago, Black Hat last year.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
spoke to thousands of people.
Yeah.
Like, was there.
But supposedly, I was a big backer of NSA as the proper lead agency for cybersecurity because of the quantity of competence. People wiser than I am said that's just a no-go, like Richard Clark. He said that businesses just won't deal with NSA, and that was before Snowden. So we do have a problem we do have some competence, but it's sort of unusable because of this stigma of Big Brother. And that was before Snowden, so now it's just impossible.
Do you have a question there, sir? Yeah.
I was wondering if Iran had done the STUDNets to us, would we won the war? That's
I don't think so. It's really quite interesting. I read a lot into Stuxnet. First of all, in terms of this semi-secrecy about whether we did it, I see it as a trial balloon by the U.S. to see what the world reaction is going to be to such an attack, and where the limits of what's possible or tolerable are and where they aren't. It's interesting the Iranians didn't go to the Court of Justice. They didn't go to the Security Council. They didn't even go to the General Assembly with their complaints. And the two major cyber powers, China and Russia, were both completely silent, unless they communicated privately their disapproval. But it was odd and interesting behavior, because a lot of people admitted that it was destruction, like a pinpoint bomb. And yet, there was no huge outcry. Now, part of it was because their activity was forbidden in the first place, or at least non-proliferation. The community behind that was unwilling to sympathize with Iran for doing this. And also, they wouldn't have been willing to come forward and let inspectors see the destruction. So, but it's a very complicated and interesting case, not so much just for the software, but just for what U.S. policy was doing there and what it showed about world reaction to a real, though small, destructive attack.
The U.S. has always reserved the right to respond with kinetic force to a cyber attack. And in fact, there was a statement in 2006 which explicitly reserved the right to respond with nuclear weapons to certain kinds of cyber attacks. That was in a Joint Chiefs of Staff publication. Now, whether we actually would ever use a cruise missile, let alone a nuclear weapon, in response to any kind of cyber attack, that's a different question. But we've always reserved the right to act, to act in that manner.
So, Randy, maybe I'm inferring too much here, but you were making sort of a distinction between sort of the ethics of cyber warfare with respect to the effect on humans, in that no one's going to get killed, versus, say, economic effects or something like that. And my inference was that you think this is a big difference in ethics, and I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit, because I don't see it as such a big difference. Because, for example, we know if someone were to contaminate the food supply, that the economic effects of that would have a lot of indirect effects on humans, right? It wouldn't cause medical problems, but, well, it would cause medical problems, but it would also cause, people to stop shopping, those kinds of things. We know what, just a little thing our friends on Wall Street did in 2007, how that affected many, many people. I mean, isn't that just as unethical, as direct harm to humans?
I think, in terms of the consequentialist utilitarian calculus, widespread damage to the economy, even if it isn't severe to any one sector, does as much damage as destroying a part of a city. It could lead to unemployment, that could lead to depression and suicides and so forth. I was originally, when I started this, I was kind of a hawk, thinking that if a country did enough economic damage to the U.S. And we had no other way of stopping it or deterring future such attacks, then we could use a kinetic attack. Maybe not nuclear, but some kinetic attack. I now have backed away from that because I think there are threshold effects that lead to escalation, and clicking it up to kinetic would invite a kinetic response, whereas punishing a nation that did that to us by other means would probably be safer and not risk the escalation. Deterrence is very tricky. There's this well-known theorist, a former Rand researcher, Martin Libicki, and he's written a great deal about the conditions that are necessary for deterrence, and also the conditions necessary for avoiding escalation. And it turns out I was more gung-ho about deterrence and counter-attacks, though cyber if possible. But now I realize that one has to be very, very careful, because deterrence doesn't work in all situations, and escalation sometimes does occur. But yeah, I share your intuition that there's no sharp divide. I guess I want there to be, or something like that.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Join me in thanking our speakers.